Welcome back to Tales from the Enchanted Forest with your hosts Fox and Sparrow.
Happy holidays, Merry Christmas, and Merry Winter season. This is our kind of holiday episode this year, so we're very excited, and we're not doing a traditional, Christmas holiday story, but we're still very excited, and we hope all you travelers are enjoying this festive season.
In the past, we've covered tons of holiday stories. We've done the story of Saint Nick, we've done the Christmas Carol, we've done folklore festive figures. So this year, we're taking a more seasonal approach. So we've also covered tons of stories about the changing of the seasons, such as the myth of Persephone. We've covered the Oak King and the Holly King, and just recently we've covered Inanna and her descent into the underworld. So with that in mind, today's story is going to be about the solstices.
The winter solstice is coming up in a couple days when this episode goes up, so y'all can enjoy that. Maybe you're listening to this episode right now as the winter solstice is happening, going, why is the day so freaking short? And you go, oh, that's right. There's a lot of reasons we know of why the days are short, thanks to all these myths we keep covering.
And as you all know from our seasonal tales, the summer solstice marks the longest day of the year and the gradual decline of the natural world until the shortest day of the year, which is the winter solstice, this year on the 21st of December. So, as we make our way towards the winter solstice and the fall of the Holly King to the Oak King, we wanted to remember a warmer time, which is why our fairy tale for today is all about fairies and the Midsummer's Tale. This story comes from British writer Barbara Leonie Picard, who not only wrote extensively about fairy tales, myths, and legends, but also created some of her own original works. The story of the Midsummer Bride, or Lord Alaric's Lady, comes from her collection called The Faun and the Woodcutter. We know the nights may be long and cozy, so settle in and enjoy them with this story. Early one midsummer's eve, Count Alaric was riding through his fields and meadows when he came across a strange maiden lying on the grass. He had never seen her before and thought it odd to find her alone in the early morning. He approached the beautiful golden-eyed maiden cautiously and asked for her name. The maiden did not look distressed or lost, but responded that she did not know. He tried again and asked her where she came from, and once again she smiled at him brightly and said she had absolutely no idea. Alaric had the curious sense that she was smiling not at him, but at something half-remembered. Being a gentleman, he offered her his hand and asked if he could escort her to wherever she was going. She thought for a moment and then responded again that she did not know if she was going anywhere. So, Alaric took her to his castle and spent many months trying to get answers from her, but it was as if she had appeared out of thin air. No one knew her or where she could have come from. Eventually, he settled on the fact that she must have lost her memory and did her every courtesy befitting a guest in his household. Eventually, they came up with the name of Catherine for her. It became apparent to everyone that the maiden had no idea how to do any sort of housework, cooking, or needlework, but no one minded since it was also clear that she was the Lord's lady. You see, over the course of their few months together, Lord Alaric and Catherine had fallen in love with each other, and eventually the Lord asked her to marry him. She willingly agreed, and the two were very happy together. However, our story doesn't just end there with a happily ever after. There were some abnormalities. When the Lord was away with work, Catherine was happy to sit in the sun for hours, staring wistfully off into the distance. Or, when there were festivities and dancing, Catherine would refuse to dance, and instead she would sit and watch the dancers with the strangest look in her eye. Lord Alaric never pushed his wife to dance and respected her wishes despite his curiosity. One day, when he returned from work, Lord Alaric found Catherine dancing alone to an invisible tune. He watched her in awe and then couldn't help himself and interrupted her. He complimented her and asked why she never danced with him. Catherine looked at him startled, as if he had woken her up from a dream, and shook her head to clear it. She responded that she never wanted to dance. Alaric said that he had just seen her doing it, and Catherine replied that that was because she had no choice. There was music playing. Alaric tried to listen carefully, but the room was quiet and still. Gently, he took his wife into his arms and said that there was no music. For the first time since they met, Catherine was frantic, and began claiming that there had been music. She had heard it. But then, after listening for a moment, she looked deflated and replied that it was all silent now.
Oh, that's just so hard. You brought in this woman who clearly has some, like, probably issues, and now you're kind of seeing it come out in other ways of, okay, she's hearing things now. Not only should she not remember anything, like, that's just got to be hard to kind of watch it unfold.
Especially since there seems to be things that are not quite right with her, and you can't put your finger on it, but you also don't want to distress her by asking her. I just know that my curiosity could never. I'd be like, what are you doing? What do you hear? What's going on?
Yeah. And it's like, if you can't even go to her family to be like, what's her family history? Like, or get context for maybe where she grew up and like what could have led to this moment. It's just, she's just a black box. You just don't know what's beyond it. And she doesn't even know. So that's like, amnesia is a interesting trope in stories because it's often a catalyst point for a main character or like a reason to not be concerned with any past issues. But in this case, it just feels so sad. It's like, oh, like we just feel disconnect and don't know how to help her.
The best thing is that I think Lord Alaric seems to actually care about her, as opposed to a lot of other characters in fairy tales that just don't really seem to care that they've imprisoned someone who's definitely going through something. So it does seem like he cares. And he shows this later on. So he held her close and asked her to tell him truthfully if she was happy. She claimed she was, but her face was far away again. Alaric was troubled but kept it to himself when he realized that she did not want to speak about it anymore. A year passed, and it was the day before Midsummer's Eve. Lord Alaric was racing home to be with his wife on the anniversary of their first meeting when he passed the field he had found Catherine in. He was astonished to hear soft music playing, and when he approached from the trees, he spied pale figures dancing in the moonlight. He knew in theory that midsummer was when fairies were sighted by mortals, but he had never witnessed them himself. He watched them cautiously until he saw in their midst a familiar figure in a crimson gown. Startled, he realized it was Catherine and panicked, thinking that the fairy people had lured her away with their song. It was not uncommon for fairies to steal away humans after all, especially at ones as beautiful as Catherine. Alaric's only thoughts turned to saving his wife, but when he tried to spur his horse forward, the creature took fright and bolted away. It took almost 3 miles of galloping before he could calm the animal down, and when he did, he tried to rush back to the meadow only to find it empty. His heart pounding with fear, Alaric all but flew back to the castle. When he burst into Catherine's room, she was in bed, sleeping softly. Relieved, he woke her up and asked her if she was okay, but sleepy Catherine responded that of course she was. He asked her where she'd been that night, and Catherine responded that she'd been in bed sleeping, of course. Smiling sweetly, she pulled him close, yawned, and promptly fell asleep.
Aww.
For a second, Alaric thought that he must have been mistaken, but his heart sank when he spotted her crimson gown thrown across a chair, the hem wet with dew. Alaric looked back at his sleeping wife and said no more of the matter, but every time he looked into her glittering eyes, he grew sad.
Aww. It's so sad.
It gets sad. This is a sad Midsummer Tale.
Yeah, because he's being respectful about it too. Like, it's so easy for him to have been like, I'm gonna go into rage mode, and then it's like, okay, yeah, you go, girl. But it's like, oh no, I feel for this dude.
I think it could also be a really good way of showing kind of how, and this is, of course, just a parallel that I'm drawing, of how, I guess, mental illness can also affect a relationship or any kind of, chronic pain, stuff like that, where it's a hidden disability where you don't know how to help someone with it. You can see they're suffering. You can see that there's something wrong. The faraway look, the sitting in her room all the time by herself, kind of like the disattachment. It almost seems like she's going through something. If we were to put this in the real world, of course, this is a fairy tale world and she's with the fairy people, so it's a bit different. But the parallel is that you have a loved one that you want to help, but you have no way of knowing how to help them.
Yeah.
Eventually, Alaric could take it no longer and went to consult Magda, the wise woman who lived on the heath. She welcomed him warmly and heard his problems. Afterwards, she was troubled and stayed quiet for a long time. Then she revealed to Alaric that Catherine was one of the fair people. Away from them, she forgot most of her old life, but close to Midsummer's Eve, the music called to her, and she would always return to dance with her people. As long as she had a little shred of memory of her past, she would never truly be his, and one day she may not return from the dance at all. Alaric grew frantic and asked if there was no way to make her completely his. Was there no way to make her forget that last little shred of memory and forget her people? Megda responded that if his love had been perfect, so perfect that it left no room in her mind for any other memories, then maybe she would be his. Something must be lacking in his love.
Oh, no.
Alaric thought about this long and hard, and then left the room, and from then on he tried everything to show Catherine just how much he loved her. But he only grew sadder and sadder when he saw her with her wistful look. The next Midsummer's Eve, Alaric watched as Catherine dressed in blue velvet and snuck away to the meadow. He trailed behind her, not knowing what he would do, and watched as she danced with the fair folk, her smile and laughter radiant. He felt his heart start to break. In a fit of anger and desperation, he donned his sword and decided he would take her from them no matter what. He would make her forget them.
Okay, now we're entering rage mode.
As he stepped into the circle, the fair folk scattered and ran. Catherine instinctively moved to run with them, but Alaric grabbed her and held her in his arms as he told her that he had come to take her home, to their home. She struggled against him, and in the distance the fair folk called out to her, begging her to return to them. Catherine tried pleading with Alaric, insisting that she would dance with her family and then return home after, but Alaric's heart had grown cold. He held her tighter and refused. Then she looked at him, and for the first time Alaric saw that she was crying. She told him that fairy people had no tears, but he had taught her how to weep just then. Knowing he would not let her go, she called to her brothers and sisters for their strength, and they rushed towards the couple. The fairies encircled them and transformed Catherine into a massive tree with the fierce wind blowing around it. Alaric held tightly to the trunk and dropped his sword, letting it fly away as he clung onto her. Then the fairy people transformed her into a vixen, and she bit him, but he still held her. They turned her into a salmon, and she tried to slip from his grasp, but he hugged her to his chest. They turned her into water, and she started trickling in through his arms, but he cupped his hands and caught her. She became wind and she became fire, but she could not get away from him. No matter how much it hurt, he refused to let go. Adrenaline pumping in his veins, he thought that if he could just hold her, then he could have her for another year. Finally, as dawn broke, Catherine sank back into her own form on her knees before him. In a quiet voice, she whispered that she could not escape him. The fairy folk wailed in response, and their forms began to scatter in the wind and the grass. Alaric fell to his knees before his wife. He asked if she stayed with him, would she remember her people? Catherine replied that she would not fully remember, but she would regret feeling that she had lost something. There would always be a soft music playing nearby. His heart broke into two, and Alaric felt deep shame for what he had just done. He asked her if she would remember her life with him if she returned to the fairy people and regret their life together. Catherine looked at him and replied that she would forget him completely in the fairy realm. For a while, Alaric stood in silence, and then he freed her, and said that he would not wish for her to have even a moment of sadness. If she would have no regrets by forgetting him, then she would be happier with the fae. Without looking back, lest he change his mind, Alaric ran to his horse and rode blindly for hours. He knew he had lost her forever.
Aww.
With a broken heart, he eventually returned to the castle and was startled to see a figure in blue velvet stumbling home. He rode up next to her and fell to her side, not believing his eyes. Catherine cried out in relief and said she was so tired of walking. She had somehow ended up in a field and had no idea how she got there. She was so afraid and so happy to see her husband coming to rescue her. Alaric lifted her onto his horse, and when he looked into her eyes, he saw nothing but her love for him. In that moment, Count Alaric knew that love is perfect only when it will give up everything, even the thing which it loves, for that thing's sake.
Aww.
The end.
Wow, that's so sad. I mean, it had a happy ending, but that was like, it was so sad in the middle there.
It was very, I mean, when I read it, I was waiting for the trials and the tribute, him to have to go to the fairy world and do a bunch of quests, kind of like Psyche and Eros, or east of the sun, west of the moon. But it ended up the trial was him just letting her go of his own free will. And so I just thought this was a really good story to kind of end off the year with, make it so that we are all remembering that the things we love, we should love them for their sake and not because, we love them. Mm-hmm. And for him, it meant letting her go and letting her choose. And obviously she chose to stay with him. But had he forced her to go with him, I think he would always have that feeling of not being good enough, of not knowing what she's thinking, of her always feeling like she's missing something. So it was a different fairy tale, I think. I haven't really read anything like it. But obviously, there are lots of different influences here. I don't know if anyone's picked them up, but of course, Barbara Leonie Picard has written a lot about different retellings. So I think a lot of it came from other influences. Mm-hmm. For example, one of the notable references here was obviously to the reference of the Ballad of Tamlin. In that tale, Enel falls in love with a mortal girl named Janet and asks her to free him from the fairy queen. He instructs her to find them in the forest and grab him, and that the fairies will turn him into all manner of beasts to force her to drop him, but she must hold on. So they turn him into a bunch of different things, and finally they turn him into a piece of coal, and she throws it into a little drop of water, and when she does, Tamlin becomes a mortal man once more. However, this act of changing shapes to escape also references other tales of metamorphosis, specifically ones from Greek stories. The one that comes to mind is the labors of Heracles, where he has to wrestle with Nereus, the old man of the sea, as he turns into various creatures in order to escape. And again, he turns into a giant fish so that he has to kind of wrestle with him and he can't stop him from slipping away. Another really interesting thing I noticed is that in fairy tales and fairy stories, we often see the case of the fairies kidnapping mortals. But here we have the reverse. Like the less common fairy wife, they are often captured by mortal men and forced to stay in the human realms under a specific condition. More often than not, years later, the condition comes to pass and the magical wife is free. In this case, for the fairy wife, we have W. Jenkins Thomas's The Welsh Fairy Book in the tale of the fairy wife, where a man kidnapped a fairy and kept her as his, and she agrees to marry him, but if he ever struck her with iron, then she would be free to go. And again, years later, he accidentally hits her with iron as he's chasing his cow, and she's free to return to the fairyland.
Okay. Accidentally hits her with an iron, which he meant to hit his cow for. I'm glad she got away.
Well, his cow was running away, and he was trying to stop the cow, and he threw the iron thing at the cow to kind of get it to stop. But yeah, I mean, if you're going to kidnap a woman and force her to marry you, maybe you shouldn't be marrying her in the first place. As we've seen with the Selkie wives, it almost never ends up well for the mortal man because she just leaves.
No. She's like, okay, I can do the waiting game. Don't worry, I can get out of this.
And of course, nowadays, with the rise of romantasy, which is the genre between romance and fantasy, we often see humans and mortals in the enemies to lovers trope, where they are in relationships with magical creatures of all varieties. For instance, we have Akatar, so A Court of Thorns and Roses, which is a rift on the Fae with the Tamlin myth and a variety of other books based on romances with vampires, werewolves, shifters, and other humanoid creatures. So you can see this trope pretty much consistently nowadays.
It's a fun one.
And with that, dear travelers, we're going to switch over to our game for today, which is called Fae News or Fake News. As we know, fairies do lots of very, very bad things. However, is everything bad a fairy's fault? It's going to be up to Sparrow to decide. Welcome back to Fake News or Fae News. I'm Fox, live from the Enchanted Forest, and this just in. Doctors warn to watch out this holiday season. If your child is born sickly and behaves strangely, then chances are that the fairies have taken your child and replaced it with one of its own. Authorities warn that this could have been done for a variety of reasons, including as an old fairy's retirement plan, to steal human children away for slavery, or to simply cause mischief. We turn to our expert Sparrow to ask, is this Fae News or fake news?
Thank you, Fox. This does seem to be something fairies do. They are definitely known for stealing away children, that much I do know. I don't know if they need it for their retirement plan per se, but kind of those details aside, I'm going to go ahead and say this is Fae News.
That is correct. This is about changelings. So in terms of the retirement plan, apparently some old fairies will change themselves to look into like babies and then replace the baby with themselves so that mortals will take care of them. So your baby might actually be a really old fairy.
Okay, yes, changelings I were familiar with. I wasn't sure if this was that specific one, but that's a nice little nod there.
Now turning to Fox for the weather. We have an unusual cold front coming in from the south, and we have a lot of snow forecast for the next few weeks. Remember that if you stumble upon this infamous house in a meadow at the bottom of a well, to make sure you do the old lady's chores as asked, otherwise you will end up with some very bad luck this holiday season. Some might say this is fey news, while others claim it's fake news. What do you think, Correspondent Sparrow?
Well, we do know fairies like to do interesting things, and some might call them crazy or harebrained. We've had some witnesses call it outright insane. But this reporter thinks that this seems very specific and not one that I'm familiar with, so I'm going to go ahead and claim that it's likely fake news. Now, Fox, care to elaborate?
That is correct. This cold front is caused by Mother Holly from the Brothers Grimm folk tales and not by any fairies as far as we know. Breaking news! A Welsh woman is under investigation after another woman has gone missing on her premises. Bystanders say a tall woman entered the house of the suspect one cold winter's day and was never seen from again. The suspect accused the missing woman of human trafficking after she offered her money in exchange for her baby. Suspect claims that after she guessed the woman's name correctly, the victim simply blew up in a temper. Police say to be on the lookout for a small woman in a green cloak singing about her own name. We turn to eyewitness expert Sparrow. What do you have to say about this new investigation?
Well, certainly our hearts go out to this Welsh woman. This awful situation that she's been in. This sounds quite disturbing. However, while we covered the first story that fairies are known to kind of kidnap children and stuff and kind of switch places, in this particular case of taking the baby in exchange for money, to me sounds like more of a witch type deal rather than a fairy. While this could very well be a fairy per se, I'm going to go ahead and call this fake news.
Well, unfortunately for you, Sparrow, this is a fey tale. This specific Welsh fairy likes to creep along and exchange babies for money. It does, however, give the parents a chance to keep their baby if they guess the fairy's name correctly, a la Rumpelstiltskin.
Yes, it seems they attended the Rumpelstiltskin school of kidnapping, which is always fun, or exchanges, I guess. Rumpelstiltskin didn't end up kidnapping anybody.
He did blow up in a temper.
He just threatened. He did blow up in a temper. So, they must be related somehow.
And finally, the workplace harassment case of Mr. Brown versus House has been dismissed after a judge declared the complaints filed as lunacy. Among Mr. Brown's numerous complaints were the lack of proper uniform, too many proper uniforms, hazardous work conditions, spotless work conditions, retaliatory complaints, and harassing compliments. Mr. Brown has vowed never to return to his place of prior employment and to appeal the court's decision. Now we turn to our expert, our employment lawyer, Sparrow. What do you have to say about the legalities of this case?
Thanks, Fox. Well, this is an interesting one. Not often do people get let go for having too many proper uniforms and some not as proper. It's a very interesting case, and I know the jury had a very hard time going over it. But this seems so fun and whimsical, I just want to say it's fake news because I want it to be true. Purely because I think it's hilarious, I am saying it must be fake news.
Well, you are the expert after all, and Mr. Brown E. does agree. The brownie likes to live in houses, and they will leave for any variety of reasons, including a spotless house, a dirty house, a clean uniform, a dirty uniform, if you give them clothes, if you do not give them clothes, if you compliment them, or if you do not compliment them. Any sort of perceived slight will send a brownie in a rage. And with that, we would like to wish you all a happy holiday season. That is the end of Fake News and Fey News. That was Fox and Sparrow reporting live from the Enchanted Forest.
That's a fun game. I like that. Thank you so much, Fox. And happy holidays, everybody. And so until next time, this has been Fox and Sparrow. And remember, there's always a place for you in the Enchanted Forest.